All right, so in this explainer, we're going to break down a document written by an author named Jonathan, and it's called We Are Winning. Our job here is just to lay out what's in the document completely neutrally, using the material itself to walk you through the arguments. So yeah, let's just get right into it. Right off the bat, the document opens with this, a really direct and, unambiguous statement. This is the central idea, the whole thesis of the piece. This confident, assertive tone pretty much sets the stage for everything that follows. According to Jonathan, this isn't some hopeful prediction. He's stating it as a fact. So, how does he get to that conclusion? We're going to follow his argument step by step. First, we'll dig into his core thesis. Then, we'll look at this corporate and financial web he describes. After that, we'll get into what he calls controlled operations. From there, we'll cover the signs he sees as proof of victory. And then finally, we'll look at what he calls the final confrontation. Okay, so let's start with Jonathan's main argument. The basic idea of the document is this. He believes there's a huge, corrupt network out there that isn't actually getting stronger. He says it's becoming desperate, frantic even, and that its collapse isn't just coming, it's actually happening right now. And here's a really key part of his argument. It's all about how you interpret what's happening in the world. He's saying that when you see things like massive corporate takeovers, you shouldn't see them as a sign of strength. Instead, he claims they're actually last-ditch efforts, maneuvers to cover up crimes inside a failing system. He's seeing desperation, where a lot of other people might just see business as usual. And that idea leads us right into his next section. See, Jonathan doesn't just make these big, sweeping claims. He actually tries to map out what he sees as a very complex web, connecting specific companies, people, and firms that he links back to intelligence agencies. And these are the big players Jonathan puts at the center of his thesis. According to his document, you shouldn't think of them as separate companies doing their own thing. In his view, they're all just nodes in one deeply interconnected network. Now, before we go any deeper, we gotta clarify a term that Jonathan uses a lot. When you see him write In-Q-Tel/Alex Brown, he states that this is his shorthand for a very specific group: the CIA, Alvin Krongard, Johns Hopkins, Apollo, and Mossad. He uses this phrase to describe the alleged power structure backing this whole network. So this slide is basically Jonathan's map. He argues that these connections you see here are no accident. He alleges that you have key people moving between major companies like Scott Gottlieb from Pfizer ending up at Tempest AI. He points to venture capital firms like Kleiner Perkins as a common thread. He uses this map to argue that these are all part of one big coordinated effort, with Tempest AI, which he claims was founded by In-Q-Tel/Alex Brown offshoots, acting as a kind of central hub. So after he lays out this alleged corporate web, Jonathan shifts gears to his next big point, what he calls an information war. He argues that this network doesn't just make moves in the boardroom. He says it's actively working to control what we all think and talk about. And to back this up, Jonathan lists some very specific examples. He points to certain public figures all making the same claim about the Jeffrey Epstein case, which he calls a deflection. He also brings up what he calls Con Inc. mouthpieces, who he says reinforce that same story, as well as things like highly scripted online chats and so-called limited hangout operatives who, in his view, deliberately ignore certain evidence. And this quote, well, it really gets to the heart of Jonathan's perspective on all this. He basically believes these operations are getting sloppy, obvious, and just really easy to see through. So for him, the big takeaway is that their attempts to control the narrative are actually backfiring and exposing the very network they're trying to keep hidden. Which brings us right back to the core thesis of the document. We are winning. Jonathan spends a big chunk of his writing laying out the specific social and political trends that he reads as clear signs of this network's collapse. So here are the key signs he presents as his evidence. In his view, these aren't just a bunch of random, separate issues. He sees them all as part of a single trend, a massive, widespread loss of public trust. He connects everything from people's skepticism about official stories and geopolitics to what he sees as total silence on major financial scandals, and he says it's all proof that the establishment is losing its grip. So, after laying out all that evidence, from the corporate links to the so-called controlled ops to the shifts in public opinion, this is the conclusion Jonathan comes to. He believes the network's actions are just so obvious now that its downfall is really just a matter of time. And that leads to the final part of his argument. He believes that the opposition, as he calls them, is now completely cornered, and they're left with only two ways to play their hand. Jonathan lays out this binary choice.
On one hand, you have the mitigate the loss option. He describes this as a kind of controlled, slow motion retreat, all designed to manage how the public sees it and make their defeat almost unnoticeable. The other option? Go full scale kinetic, which he completely dismisses. He sees it as a suicidal move that would lead to their immediate, catastrophic failure. So in his mind, it's a no-brainer. He's certain they've chosen the first path, a managed decline.
And that brings his entire argument full circle. Even though Jonathan describes the other side's strategy as this slow walk retreat, he ends his document by getting rid of any doubt about the final score. He makes this final, really emphatic declaration, asserting that the outcome is already decided. So, as we've seen, Jonathan's document takes all these different corporate deals, political events, and public statements and weaves them into one single big story. And when you look at all this material, the question that really stands out is about pattern recognition. It sort of forces you to think about how we all process complex information, and it leaves you wondering, where is that line between discovering a pattern that's really there and creating one yourself out of unconnected dots?